Mr. Walden, have you received an answer to your questions? Are we?
No, no, Mr. Chairman. I was under the impression that they were going to answer when we got back.
Oh, okay. Are we prepared to answer the question Mr. Walden propounded?
Could you repeat the question so we make sure we answer the right question?
You bet. I will attempt to do that. The question was, where are the allocations? Excuse me. Where are where in the bill are the various industries that were singled out for assistance? Where are those allocations? I understand they're in like Title III and Title IV, perhaps.
Yeah, the allocations are in.
I'm sorry. Can you speak? It's hard to hear right here.
The allocations are in the primary set of allocations are in Section 782 of the Clean Air Act, the section that would add Section 782, and that appears on. That appears on page 553. Okay. And there are a number of subsections in Section 782 that allocate allowances to industry. And that sets out the specific amounts that go to, for all of the different purposes, for all the different programs. Then in particular for industry as well in Title IV.
So that's, the first one's Title III of the bill?
The first is Title III.
Thank you.
And it's the new Section 782 to the Clean Air Act.
Thank you.
That's why it's 782 of the Clean Air Act, and it is it's actually Section 321 of the bill, but it's Section 782 of the Clean Air Act that has the allocations for all of the industry sources and for others. And then in Title IV, Title IV, and it is on starting on page 736 in what will be new Section 764 of the Clean Air Act. That section and one or two sections following that set forth the criteria for how the allocations to energy-intensive trade-exposed industries would be divided up.
And is there one final question, Mr. Chair, is there a definition for energy-intensive trade-exposed industries? Where would I find that?
There are specific criteria, and you would find that in Section 764, eligible industrial sources.
764, okay. And do you happen to have a page number on
yes, it's page 736.
736. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence.
Mr. Stupak?
Mr. Chairman, move strike last word. Mr. Chairman, on this amendment here proposed by Mr. Rogers of Michigan, I'd yield to Mr. Doyle of Pennsylvania for comment.
I thank my friend. Just a point of clarification, and it speaks to what Mr. Walden was talking about. We didn't sit down and just start picking industries out. There was actually a very objective criteria used to decide which industries qualified for this type of assistance. And what we did is measure energy intensity versus trade intensity. To qualify for the program, the industry has to be at least have 5% energy intensity and 15% trade intensity. So if you fell within that metric, then you were eligible for assistance under the program. So it was a very objective standard, and we didn't set out to just, pick, like I didn't get to sit down and say, hey, I want to do the steel industry. We're looking specifically for high energy-intensive companies with trade pressure. So that's the metric that was used, and that determines which eligible. I think it's my understanding 41 different industries, I mentioned 3 or 4 of them, actually qualify under this metric.
Would the gentlelady yield for me just to make one other comment, a question of the gentleman from Pennsylvania, or I'm sorry, it's Mr. Stupak has the time. I'm sorry.
Sure.
You said there are 40. What I'm trying to figure out, because I fear I'll get asked this question, am I covered? Am I an industry that's covered if I'm a farmer? Clearly, in my part of the world, they use a lot of energy to farm wheat and harvest wheat, and they're very trade sensitive. Now, I know ag is sort of exempted from the bill to begin with. But you see what I'm saying? So I'm trying to just find out, where do I go look for the what that means.
We'd be happy to provide it. We actually had there was actually a nice graph that I just don't have it with me here that sort of listed industries and where they fell on the metric. In terms, some industries were very energy intensive but didn't meet the 15% trade intensity. They didn't get to be part of the bill, and some vice versa. So some met one criteria but not the other. It was important, when we did the metric, that we have some objective way of saying who gets to be in the program and who doesn't, not just to pick and choose who we wanted in there. So we'll be happy to make sure you have that information.
So where would I get that information? Since we're sort of voting on this amendment very soon here, I know. Do you have, does somebody on the staff have that graph you referenced, that matrix?
We'll check and try to get it to you. But, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, it's a very objective standard, 15 and 5.
Or it does.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Stupak.
I still have 2 minutes, yes.
I was just going to ask under that same thing. Is textiles one of the areas that's covered under this, Mike?
I don't believe textiles.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are we ready for the question on the pending amendment? Yes, gentleman from Louisiana. From Georgia, excuse me.
We sound alike, Mr. Chairman. I can understand that. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I know we're getting close to the end on this amendment, but I felt very strongly the need to speak out in favor of this amendment, the Rogers Amendment. I think that it's an amendment that we absolutely should pass. Now, I realize that there are members on the majority side that are very pleased with credits or whatever you want to call it in regard to certain industries, and they met certain standards to be able to get that kind of treatment. And I feel very confident that there was nothing political about any of that. Cases were made, and whether we're talking about for oil patch Democrats or steel industry, aluminum industry, or maybe even the homeless folks that needed help in LIHEAP. But I think the bottom line, Mr. Chairman, is what I said in my opening statement yesterday, and I want to just take one paragraph of that opening statement. This legislation manufactures a cost of business that otherwise does not exist. Let me repeat, does not exist, regardless of any formulas or allocations or credits to shift these additional costs around. Someone in this country, the United States, is going to pay, and ultimately it will be all of us, because this plan will hurt the entire economy. And that's the whole purpose of I think, the Rogers Amendment in regard to China. We have heard a number of members defend the policy, cap and trade, what we're doing here with the American Energy and Security Act of 2009, saying that the president needs something to take to Copenhagen to show good faith to these other countries, and maybe to influence them in such a positive way that they'll want to jump on board and become part of the band and maybe march right off the cliff with us. But it wasn't 6 weeks ago, I don't think, that the president took a little trip over to the UK and in London met with the group of 20 and asked for a little help. Please, God, a little help in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Afghanistan, and where are our NATO partners, and what are they doing, and how many troops have they been willing to commit? And you know, I don't hear any great outcry from any of these other countries saying, well, we'll absolutely, you can have another 300, you can have another 500. Oh, by the way, we agree with you that we need to get these men and women in the fight and not just sitting around the perimeter somewhere smoking cigarettes. They're going to be in the line of fire at the tip of the spear, and we're going to shed some blood just like you are for the greater good. Now, I know these, we call these things overseas contingency operations. We don't call them wars. But this situation that we're talking about with our economy is just as critical we're talking about people losing jobs, losing their homes, really, really struggling. And yet, you know, where is the righteous indignation over the fact that we're leading the band and we're not having too many people following us in regard to defending our country when our men and women are shedding most of the blood. So, I mean, I think we can't have it both ways, and I think it's important for us to understand that we're putting a tremendous burden on our people for the sake of the world reducing greenhouse gases in China and India. And as Mr. Rogers has pointed out, you know, you're talking about a third of the world's population, and the amount of pollutant, and I think over the last 20 years, our carbon footprint probably has increased about 23%. And the carbon production over the same period of time by India is 440%, and that of China is just a little bit behind that, maybe 420%. So I don't think we need to be going this alone any more than we should be going it alone in Afghanistan and Iraq. I would apply the same principles to it. This idea, Mr. Speaker, of getting these credits, I think Mr. Scalise was absolutely right. These credits are time limited, and when they run out, whether it's 15, 20, 25 years, my friend from Pennsylvania may have felt that he really cut a good deal and swapped a good knife for a better one. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen to those companies? I think Mr. Scalise hit the nail right on the head. They may very well just be making plans to head south, and south is offshore. So this is a good amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Gentleman's time has expired. I wanted to recognize Mr. Barrow.
Just for a brief comment, Mr. Chair.
Let me recognize Mr. Green, but will you yield to me?
Brief comment.
Oh, go ahead.
I know that was said, but coming from Texas, Louisiana, and Georgians don't sound alike.
Will the gentleman yield to me since he has the time? Mr. Green? Yeah, thank you. I just want to draw the members' attention to what this amendment before us provides. It says the administrator, in consultation with the Department of State, the U.S. Trade Representative, annually prepare and certify a report whether China and India have adopted greenhouse gas emission standards at least as strict as ours. And if they haven't, I'm paraphrasing now, then the provisions of the Act shall cease to be effective. Now, this Act has a number of parts to it. It has a part to bring about greater efficiency. We'll stop that. It has a provision to deal with renewable fuels. Well, we'd stop that. It has a cap on the total emissions and encouraging greater efficiency, and in doing so, investments in carbon sequestration. We'd stop that. We have money for research and development to other technologies. We'd stop that. We would stop all the things that this bill would have us do to make ourselves more energy independent and a leader in our own fate in terms of how we're going to meet our energy needs. All of that would be stopped if India or China didn't do as good a job as we're doing. We would stop. Are we going to leave our fate to India and China to drag their feet, maybe intentionally, and then say, well, we're not going to try to find more ways to be efficient in the use of energy. We're not going to continue to find alternatives. We're not going to look for a way to burn coal in this country with a technology that would stop any damage to the environment. Even though coal is a natural resource, we don't import it. We need the investments in the technology. We need this bill. But we don't want this provision to stop us in our tracks. So I would urge members to vote against this amendment and to support the bill, to move forward with the legislation. Who yielded? Mr. Green yielded to me. I don't know if others want time. I just wanted to make these additional comments.
Mr. Chairman.
I presume he yields back the balance of his time. And we'll now go to this side if there's further discussion.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Shimkus.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciated your comments. We would stop a lot of things, but the biggest thing we would stop would be the increased cost that's going to go to fossil fuel users around this country. And that increased cost will have a burden of job dislocation. This bill recognizes the fact that there will be job losses. That's why you have mitigation. I would wish every member would talk on this amendment, because this is a jobs bill. This is a jobs amendment. This is a jobs bill for China and a jobs bill for India. So if you want to put up what Southern Illinois put up with after the 1990 Clean Air Act, with 15,000 mine workers losing their jobs, or the state of Ohio that lost 35,000 coal miner jobs, we are going down that route. I concur with my colleagues. And the former chairman of the Energy Subcommittee in the last Congress was at a meeting with a senior Chinese official. He was asked twice by 2 Democrats in that meeting, will you ever comply to a international cap and trade regime? His response was no. And he went on to say, the West developed their middle class by the use of fossil fuels, and now it is our turn. The West developed their middle class by the use of fossil fuels, and now it's our turn. Well, they're going to develop their middle class. They're going to develop their middle class on the job dislocation brought about by this bill. And that dislocation is already accepted by this bill as a premise of this bill, because there is mitigation here to try to soften that blow. But make no mistake, there will be job losses. So what all this amendment says is, let's go and comply. This is all pain. I've said this in numerous hearings. This bill is all pain for the United States economy and no gain. If India and China do not comply, you're going to have increased carbon dioxide emissions. So you're going to go through all this 900-page bill, set up this whole new bureaucracy, costing thousands of dollars, charging ratepayers more for no environmental benefit. None. It's incredible. It's ludicrous. And not only that, is we're going to push job dislocation in a time when this economy can ill afford it. I find it incredible that we would make it more difficult for manufacturers and job creation in our economy today by moving this bill. When we started down this route in January this year, and this is just the first, really, of many amendments that my friends are going to have to vote against, that they will come back and see that will haunt them. Because what you are saying is China and India do not have to comply. We are going to comply, and we're going to make it more difficult for us to manufacture goods to compete in the world market. Go ahead. Have your vote. I'm voting for this amendment.
Well, gentlemen,
I would yield.
Mr. Chairman, I have a chart that we've provided to your clerk on percent change in CO2 emissions by country. Are y'all able to put that up on the screen? We've provided it. I don't know if you've got it where you can put it up on the screen.
I don't know.
Well, I'll submit it for the record, but it shows.
Without objection, the charts would be
It's an
accepted.
EIA chart, Institute of Energy Research. It shows between 2000 and 2007 that China's emissions have doubled, and that India's emissions have gone up about 38%, Russia's have gone up about 10%, and the United States has gone up less than 1%. In absolute numbers, the U.S. has gone from 5,860 metric tons to 5,902, which is 0.1% or a total growth rate of 42 tons. China has gone from a little under 3,000 metric tons to over 6,000. China is growing at an annual rate of 17% a year. 17%. You know, there's the chart. And then So as a number of our speakers have pointed out, Mr. Chairman, asking the United States, which has already basically frozen its CO2 emissions, to have to do some of these fairly drastic reductions without even acknowledging the growth rate in China, which is larger in absolute terms than the United States, and the growth rate in India, which is number 3 and will catch up with us probably in the next 10 years, just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And I'll submit this on for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are we ready for the question? Mr. Boyer?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I need to provide a voice to Indiana and their concerns with regard to this climate change bill, in particular cap and trade. My good friend Barron Hill, also from Indiana, can voice his opinion. But our Governor Mitch Daniels has recently wrote a Wall Street Journal piece that I would ask unanimous consent to be included in the record.
Without objection.
And he voices his great concerns, and it almost is very pertinent to our discussion here today about exempting China and India. So I'm pleased that you've incorporated his remarks in the record. With regard to some comments made on steel, Indiana is known for its steel industries, and I, like probably other members of the committee, have provided testimony over the years to the International Trade Commission regarding the impact of the newly independent states in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Indonesia, and South America with regard to their excess capacity in steel over the last decade and its impact upon not only the global market of steel, but in particular our domestic production of steel. I personally believe that the combination of subsidies, protections, cartels, excess capacities created an irresistible incentive, almost an imperative for the producers in these countries to sell their steel abroad at virtually any price. And it damaged our industries here in the United States. I'm pleased that our own federal government, with regard to comprehensive relief under Section 201 of our trade laws, had to take comprehensive and broad approaches to protect our industry. But let's please understand that impact upon our steel industry was coming from these unfair trade practices that were placing our steel industry at disadvantage. So I wanted that to be placed on the record. I do have great concerns with regard to China, in particular now that it has overtaken the United States to become the world's biggest emitter, while India becomes the third biggest emitter by 2015, according to the International Energy Agency and the World Energy Outlook report. So exempting China and India from any form of binding caps is an equivalent to giving them an emissions-free pass for their economic elites. So when I think of Indiana, and we are a 93 to 96% dependent upon coal as a source with regard to our energies, and according to how the allocations will be spread in this bill, our state has a tremendous penalty, not only to our manufacturing businesses, but also to our consumers. And I am equally concerned that we are truly picking winners and losers. So if you're in a manufacturing area and you are dependent upon individuals that make those spare parts, the emissions requirements, if you add a trade requirement on there, Mr. Doyle, even to our not only our foundries. If you're going to say to those foundries out there that, well, you don't meet this particular requirement, we're going to offshore those parts. And there's going to be a tremendous job loss. And so I suppose that some members of the committee are finding some form of satisfaction that that quote is okay. I'm deeply concerned. I'm glad that we're having a discussion with regard to steel because, you know, if we wanted to start our own country somewhere, there are probably 10 basic elements that you're going to need in order to be successful. not only water, portable water and food, but you need steel. And it's very important to our national security. And to think that somehow that we're going to allow the offshoring of our manufacturing capabilities and to become a service society is tremendously concerning to me. And so I just wanted to add my voice in support of the amendment, and I will yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yield back his time. All those in favor of the previous question say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
The previous question is ordered. The ayes have it.
You just ended discussion of the whole bill.
A previous question on this amendment.
No. Mr. Chairman, you've got the bill open for amendment at any point. You have just ended discussion on the entire bill.
No.
Yes, you have. I hope you're happy because that's what you've just done. For the first time in 50 years, you have cut off debate on a major bill in committee.
Gentlemen,
I know the rules, Mr. Chairman.
Well, gentlemen will permit. I've asked for the previous question on the pending amendment.
It's not what you said. That is not what you said. I'll ask the clerk to read back what you just said.
Well, we don't want the previous question on the bill.
Then you better ask unanimous consent to rescind your motion.
Well, let me ask unanimous consent that we proceed to the vote on this amendment.
I object to that. We still have members that wish to speak on the amendment.
What members wish to speak on the pending amendment?
You got two right down there.
I will speak as well.
And we'll have at least one more on this side. Then the chair will recognize the three.
Well, first you have to.
Without objection, the chair will recognize the three people who are seeking recognition.
Well, first you have
and
to.
They will.
Mr. Chairman, if we're going to go by the rules, we're going to go by the rules.
I don't believe the gentleman's correct, but let me ask unanimous consent that any action that has been taken be voided so that we can hear from three more members, and then we will proceed to a vote. Without objection, that's the order. The chair recognizes.
It's Ms. Blackburn from
No, well, I was
Tennessee.
looking at the gentleman next to you, but Mr. Burgess. But let's recognize you next. Didn't you speak on this amendment?
No, sir.
Okay, the gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate that, and I wanted to say a few things about the amendment in support of the amendment, and I thank you for the recognition there. I do support this amendment, and I am very concerned about what will happen if we do not pass Mr. Rogers' amendment. Mr. Chairman, I appreciated what you had to say about it would terminate investment, it would terminate all these things if we were to pass this amendment, and we found that China and India were not coming into compliance, or their emissions were not meeting the standards that were set. Now, the important thing about this is we are shipping jobs out of this country because of what will take place with this cap-and-trade bill. We all are hearing it in Tennessee, where we have our auto manufacturers, our parts manufacturers, our aftermarket auto parts manufacturers. They are very, very concerned. And when I go in to visit with them at their plants and I ask them how they're doing, many times they talk about how very difficult it is to continue manufacturing in this country because of the impact that we have with environmental regulation. Now, as I have said many times, we are all for clean water, we're all for clean air, we are all for clean energy. We are not for taxing people out of their house and home to get there. We are not for passing bills that are going to cause people to lose their job. Unless we take this amendment and unless we consider what is happening with the chief emitters out there, which are going to be China and India, we are putting ourselves at a disadvantage, a competitive disadvantage. I think it is important that we not have a bill that is punishment, which right now, that's what this piece of legislation appears to be, is punishment for trying to be a manufacturer in this country. And Mr. Chairman, I don't think that you and our good colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to be the party of punishment when it comes to jobs growth and jobs retention in this country. So I would encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. I would encourage my colleagues to think long and hard about what we are doing to jobs growth and jobs retention in this country and the burden that we are placing on our employers. With that, I will be happy to yield my time to whomever would seek recognition or seek to claim the balance of my time. Anybody? I yield back.
Generally yields back. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman. I move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And, Mr. Chairman, for the purpose of actually addressing a question to the author of the amendment, and we've been at this so long, I just wanted to be sure that I heard the author correctly when he gave his offering statement to the amendment. Did I hear correctly that you said that the United States has actually reduced its energy intensity over the period of time that Europe has employed its cap-and-trade regimen to the point where our energy intensity is actually less than that of Europe? Did I understand that correctly? And I'll yield to the gentleman.
To the gentleman, that is correct. Under the European Union, under cap-and-trade, they reduced it 16.8%. Under the United States, using innovation and private industry, was done over 20% in the same time frame.
And reclaiming my time, could the gentleman tell me, because I don't know the time frame that the cap-and-trade regimen was in effect in Europe?
I believe it's since 2003, if that's the right number.
And I thank the gentleman for reclaiming my time. So during the last 7 years, or I'm sorry, the last 6 years of the Bush administration, when we were told that nothing has happened in this regard, we actually reduced our energy intensity greater than the European Union, who was under a cap-and-trade regimen. I'll yield to the gentleman.
That is correct, sir.
Well, I think I heard someone else. Thank you for reclaiming my time. I think I heard someone else reference the fact that we wanted the president to have something to take to Copenhagen. I would submit the president can take this to Copenhagen and be quite satisfied that he's done, that he inherited a good start from his predecessor. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman is yielded back. Anyone else wish to be recognized on the pending amendment? Are we ready for the vote on the pending amendment?
Chairman.
Mr. Hall.
I'd like to strike the last word.
Oh, Mr. Hall would like to strike the last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thought for a while it's going to be the last word for the whole bill. You know, this is pretty simple amendment. Just administrator, but he can't do it by himself. The Department of State's got to help. The United States Trade Rep has to pitch in and prepare and certify that for China and India, and that the standards be at least as strict as those standards that you're trying to require under this act. But the last part there says standards at least as stringent as those set forth in this act. The provision of this act shall cease to be effective. And the only way that this act could cease to be effective is for us to yield to Congress to China's very arrogant statement. And the president's gone all over the world saying that we're not a Christian nation and that we're an arrogant nation. You talk about arrogance, China takes the lead in being an arrogant nation when they say that they're going to have to produce for us because we're losing all the jobs because of this bill and other such similar bills, that they're going to have to produce for us and sell to us, and as such, we're going to be obligated to cleanse China's skies. Well, that's outrageous, and our president, I think, ought to be careful about what he says, trying to make the world love him and hate us. We're not an arrogant nation, and we are a Christian nation, and where we don't just apply to the Christianity, we allow others to observe their own pursuit of their worship. We aren't a Christian nation where people run their people in our airplane, fly into our building, murder our people, and do it because their God tells us to. I just think that that this act could not cease to be effective any other way, and I don't see why we don't vote yes on this amendment. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Just for the clarification of the parliamentary situation, it's good to have Mr. Barton sitting here next to me because he has a great deal more experience as a chairman of this committee than I have had. And he is correct on the parliamentary situation. If we want to end the debate on a pending amendment, there may be a vote to end the debate, but if it's put as ordering the previous question, which I mistakenly thought would get us to end debate on the pending amendment, that would end debate on all amendments. So I thank Mr. Barton for his knowledge on parliamentary procedures and
learned it from Mr. Dingles.
But we will not ask for a vote to end the debate. I think we have ended the debate on the pending amendment, and we'll now proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the pending amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call vote.
We'll proceed to a roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? I'm sorry. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Deguette? Ms. Deguette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Yes. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Have all members responded to the vote?
Okay. Mr.
Boucher. Well, you call him.
Okay. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no.
See if he's available. Mathis. Clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 22, the nays were 36.
Ayes 22, nays 36. If there's no objection, Mr. Murphy would like to be recorded as voting aye.
Voting aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. That would be the ayes are 23, the nays are 36.
23 ayes, 36 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.